Hi, my name is John Gabriel Salguero, and today we'll be discussing to what extent does groupthink contribute to radicalization and domestic terrorism within the United States. With that being said, here is a graph displayed by Pew Research study showing domestic terror attack and plots and the fatalities related to those plots from 1994 all the way to 2021, up into our current day and age. Over the past 10 years, domestic terrorism has risen sharply, and public concern over domestic terrorism has increased as well, obviously. Which brings us to the answer to today's research question, which is that groupthink severely contributes to the process of radicalization and consequently domestic terrorism within the United States. With that being said, to understand radicalization, domestic terror, and groupthink in its context, we first need to understand four key terms, which are defined by the FBI and Oxford Languages. Domestic terror are violent criminal acts committed by individuals who are inspired or associated with designated foreign terrorist organizations. The big difference between violent crime and domestic terror is the association with terrorist organizations. The FBI pre-classifies these organizations, distinguishing it from violent crime. Extremism, which is the holding of extreme political or religious views, is an ideology, a set of beliefs that a person holds that sway in a major way from the general public. Radicalization is the pathway used to get to extremism, the action or process of causing someone to adopt radical positions on political or social issues. Radicalization, in this sense, is essentially the agent that causes an individual to have extremism. Groupthink, the main focus of today's presentation, is the practice of thinking or making decisions as a group in a way that discourages creativity or individual responsibility. Today we'll be explaining how groupthink contributes not only to radicalization, but domestic terror, while also placing extremism in that context. Here is a graph from the cultural evolutionary trade-off of ritualistic synchrony, displaying one of the key things about groupthink and its relationship to ritualistic synchrony. Ritualistic synchrony is essentially taking actions together as a group that promotes group cohesiveness, but also has a large number of other consequences. While there are some positives such as cooperation, coordination, and cohesion, there are also downsides such as harmful obedience, conventionality, and the big focus, groupthink. Now, groupthink differs from ritualistic synchrony in one major way, that it isn't just the actions taken, but it's also the ideology that leads to those actions. In this way, groupthink and ritualistic synchrony are relatively interchangeable except for this small change. In this way, not only does ritualistic synchrony contribute to groupthink, but groupthink has a lot of the same consequences as ritualistic synchrony in a group setting, such as harmful obedience and conventionality. With that, we begin our first point, which is that groupthink limits autonomy and promotes conformity. Here is a graph from Fathali M. Magadam showing a 6-step process in the process of radicalization, starting from the ground floor all the way to the 5th floor. The major things to note are the group conformity and the step before acting out. Seen in the 5th floor, Fathali describes transcendence of the prevention mechanisms, acting out. What this essentially means is that individuals who are radicalized begin to act out at this 5th step. But right before they act out and commit domestic terrorism, they're on the 4th floor, categorical thought and consolidation of the group. Essentially, it's the legitimization of the terrorist organization. When individuals come together, they share their ideas and they contribute to group polarization, where individuals in a group continue to develop their radical beliefs and aren't exposed to differing opinions. They also contribute to in-group versus out-group bias, where the in-group is blamed as the victims, which are the radical individuals, and the out-group is the rest of society. Also to note is the psychological interpretation of the lived conditions, which will be explained later. Not only do radical individuals consider themselves as the oppressed, but because of the in-group, out-group bias, they express this concern through violent action. Here is our two perspectives from the radicalized and the out-group in the in-group versus out-group bias. Here we have radicalized individuals and non-conformist civilians. Radicalized individuals view themselves as a separate entity and are essentially autonomous in their own beliefs, but they consider themselves as oppressed, while an individual who isn't susceptible to radicalization gives and takes allegiance with critical thinking. They give dissenting opinions, which is essentially the opposite of groupthink, where you're able to express yourself, and they identify by more than one group. A quote from the FBI and an investigation of radicalization clearly explains prisoners who were radicalized serving as guerrilla warriors, swearing allegiance to LeVar Washington in one case study. They eventually went on to plan and commit to a terrorist plot, which eventually fell through and did not succeed. With that begins our second point, which is that groupthink fosters the formation of extremist groups. Displayed is the percent of key reasons of why individuals join radical Islamic movements. Researchers interviewed a number of Islamic affiliates that were radical after they were arrested and sent to prison. Notice the compliance and internalization, with compliance at 21% and internalization at 78%. Bigger to note is the collective identity and propaganda used that allow individuals to become radicalized. Groupthink contributes not only to the formation, but the growth of extremist groups by having individuals conform to propaganda and identify themselves as a collective whole, getting rid of the concept of individual opinions. With that, we have groupthink's results. In terms of a group cohesiveness, as mentioned through ritualistic synchrony, individuals are assimilated into extremist groups, conform to group actions, and eventually act out for approval. The individual consequences on the self result in a lack of identity, victimization, as mentioned earlier, and their susceptibility to propaganda. With that, our third and final point, groupthink and the resulting domestic terror. Now, displayed are a list of events of domestic terror within the United States, ranging all the way from 2001, most notably the 9/11 attacks, all the way to 2022. The major events, the attack on the Capitol and the 9/11 events, were direct results of radicalization and groupthink. Individuals, part of the Al-Qaeda group, conformed to their own opinions and were willingly able to sacrifice their lives in a threat to the United States when they crashed the planes. The attack on the Capitol is very similar in this sense, because radicalized individuals were willing to storm the Capitol in an effort to overturn an election. Here are more individual case studies. One from Proud Boy defendants from 2017 to 2021, from Proud Boy characteristics and continuity, and the graph mentioned earlier. These are direct cases of extremist groups and their violent crime, linking domestic terror to the extremist groups and consequently groupthink. With that being said, we have groupthink in summation, essentially a conclusion. Displayed here is the relationship between groupthink and domestic terror. Groupthink contributes to radicalization, extremist groups, and eventually domestic terror in the ways shown. With that, we have the work cited. Thank you for your time. What questions do you have?
2 questions for you. First one, how valid and reliable were the sources that you use, and then how do you know?
The validity of the sources. There were 2 types of sources I know, which essentially cross-checked each other in terms of reliability. I have the radicalization model processes, and then the statistics to back it up. The data shown were the plots of domestic terror events and the charts such as like Proud Boy characteristics. They show direct examples of violent crime from extremist groups. Now, the models shown by psychologists are reliable in the sense that there are psychologists making the information. They understand and have studied the pathways, such as the Handbook of the Criminology of Terrorism, which is one of the major sources that I used in this information.
Okay, and second question. If you had more time, what additional research would you conduct on this issue?
If I had more time, I would try to research radicalization outside of jihadism. Jihadism is a very prominent aspect of radicalization research because of the 9/11 attacks, but in this sense, it's very skewed. There's a lot more information on jihadist terrorism, which is extreme Muslim rulings, in comparison to radical right-wing and radical left-wing movements. So seeing the disparities between the two would give a better picture of how groupthink plays a role in all of them.